In January of 1820, 3 ships were moving through waters that no vessel in recorded history had entered before. The commander of the lead expedition was a Russian naval captain named Fabian von Bellingshausen. He had been at sea since the age of 10, had sailed with Krusenstern on the first Russian circumnavigation of the globe, had spent years charting coastlines in the Black Sea and Baltic. He was not a man easily surprised by the sea. What he saw on the 27th of January 1820, when his ships pushed through the pack ice at the edge of what we now call Antarctica, surprised him enough that he struggled to describe it in his logs. Not because it was beautiful, because it was wrong. The continent that came into view was not what anyone had imagined. Europeans had theorized about a great southern landmass for 2,000 years. The ancient Greeks had reasoned that a continent must exist in the south to balance the landmasses of the north, or the high world would tip. Aristotle had called it Antarcticos. Ptolemy had drawn it. Renaissance cartographers had placed it on maps with confident borders and invented coastlines. By the time Bellingshausen arrived, the expectation of a southern continent was one of the oldest unchallenged assumptions in Western geographic thought. What he found was not the temperate navigable landmass the theorists had imagined. It was ice so vast and so thick and so total that it was not immediately clear there was a continent beneath it at all. It looked less like land than like the end of the world, a white wall rising from the water, featureless, silent and immovable. He charted what he could and turned back. A British captain named Bransfield sighted the Antarctic Peninsula 3 days later. An American sealer named Nathaniel Palmer made contact with the continent later that year. 3 nations, 3 sightings the same decade, and none of them could agree on what exactly they had found. What they had found was the largest repository of preserved geological history on Earth. They simply had no way of knowing that yet. Antarctica covers approximately 14 million square kilometers. 98% of that surface is ice. Not frozen sea, not a seasonal ice cap that retreats in summer. Permanent, ancient, compacted glacial ice that in some places reaches a depth of more than 4 kilometers. The ice sheet that sits on top of Antarctica is not a thin coating. It is a structure. It has weight enough to depress the bedrock beneath it. Remove the ice and the continent would, over millennia, rise. The ice did not always exist. This is the first thing that reframes everything. 66 million years ago, Antarctica was still joined to Australia. The climate was subtropical. Fossils recovered from the continent show evidence of palm trees, ferns, marsupial fauna, a landscape that would be unrecognizable to anyone who has seen a photograph of Antarctica today. As the continent drifted south and the climate shifted, the forest retreated. The ice came gradually, then all at once. Scientists estimate that the East Antarctic ice sheet, the largest body of ice on Earth, formed approximately 34 million years ago, burying the landscape beneath it in a process that has not reversed since. Beneath the ice, the old world is still there. This is the part that requires a moment to fully absorb. The continent under the ice is not a flat, featureless plain. It has a landscape, a complete one. Mountains, valleys, rivers, lakes, a terrain shaped over millions of years by the same geological forces that shaped every other continent on Earth, and then frozen in place, preserved in nearly perfect condition by the ice that covered it. In 1958, Soviet scientists conducting seismic surveys in the interior of East Antarctica detected something they could not initially explain. The readings suggested a mountain range buried beneath the ice, a significant one. When the data was analysed, the range turned out to be approximately 1,200 kilometres long, with peaks reaching nearly 3,000 metres. In scale and profile, it was comparable to the European Alps. It had never been seen by human eyes. It had no name. It was entirely beneath the ice. They named it the Gamburtsev Subglacial Mountains, after the Soviet geophysicist who had first identified the anomaly. The range had been there for hundreds of millions of years, formed when ancient continents collided to build the supercontinent Gondwana, preserved intact beneath the ice because the ice that covered it prevented the erosion that would have worn it down. By the time scientists had the technology to map it properly, in expeditions conducted during the International Polar Year of 2007 to 2009, ice-penetrating radar revealed that the Gamburtzevs were not a geological curiosity. They were the origin point of the entire East Antarctic ice sheet, the place where, 34 million years ago, the glaciers had first formed and then spread outward to cover the continent. A mountain range the size of the Alps sitting under kilometers of ice, never mapped, never sampled, never touched. Scientists have noted that we have rock samples from the surface of the Moon. We have no rock samples from the Gamburtsev Mountains. The mountains are not alone under the ice. Not close. In 1957, a Soviet geographer named Andrei Kapitsa was collecting seismic data near what would become the Soviet Antarctic Station at Vostok when he noticed something in the readings that did not fit the model. The ice in that region was behaving as if there was liquid water beneath it. He made a note and moved on. The technology of the time could not confirm what he suspected. The confirmation came in stages. British scientists conducting airborne radar surveys in 1974 detected anomalous readings near the Vostok station. A European satellite called ERS-1 was directed at the region in 1991 and confirmed the earlier finding. In 1996, the discovery was published in the journal Nature. Beneath 4 kilometers of ice in East Antarctica, there was a lake of liquid water kept from freezing by geothermal heat from the Earth's interior, sealed under the ice for an estimated 15 million years. Lake Vostok is the 16th largest lake in the world by area. It is roughly the size of Lake Ontario. It has been sealed in total darkness under pressure from miles of ice above it for a span of time that predates the emergence of the human species by approximately 14,900,000 years. It is not alone either. Scientists have now identified more than 600 subglacial lakes across Antarctica. Some are connected by rivers that flow under 4 kilometers of ice channeled by pressure and geothermal heat, moving slowly through a landscape that has not seen sunlight in tens of millions of years. In February of 2012, Russian scientists finally drilled through to Lake Vostok itself, reaching the water after decades of drilling and considerable international debate about whether doing so was wise. What they found in the accretion ice, the water that had frozen back onto the bottom of the ice sheet, included genetic material from microorganisms. Life, sealed under the ice for 15 million years, apparently still alive. This is the point where the maps become relevant. In 1913, workers cleaning the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul found a document that had been sitting in the library archives for 400 years. It was a map drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis. Among the land masses depicted on this map was a southern continent, drawn with a coastline, with geographical features, with river inlets that correspond in some analyses to the actual topography of coastal Antarctica. Piri Reis documented his sources. He drew from roughly 20 older maps, including one that had belonged to Christopher Columbus. Columbus's map has not survived. The sources he used to draw the southern continent have not been identified. In 1531, a French mathematician named Arance Fine published a world map that shows a southern continent labelled in Latin as recently discovered but not yet completely known. This was 3 centuries before the first recorded sighting of Antarctica by any European expedition. Fine's continent has an interior drainage system, rivers flowing inward toward a central region, that matches in general outline the subglacial river systems that scientists have only mapped in the last several decades using ice-penetrating radar. The mainstream explanation is that both maps reflect the ancient Aristotelian tradition of a theoretical southern continent, combined with the cartographer's habit of filling unknown space with reasonable guesswork. This is the most defensible position, and most historians of cartography hold it. It does not fully account for the river systems. It does not fully account for Fine's label. recently discovered, or explain what he believed had been recently discovered and by whom. And it does not account for the question that sits underneath all of it. If the maps are guesswork, how does the guesswork correspond to geological features that were not mapped by modern science until the 1990s? In 1959, 12 nations gathered in Washington to negotiate an agreement about Antarctica. The timing matters. The International Geophysical Year of 1957 to 1958 had brought together scientific expeditions from 12 countries: the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, France, Argentina, Australia, Chile, Japan, New Zealand, Norway, South Africa, and Belgium, in the most intensive coordinated study of Antarctica ever conducted. Among the findings of that year were the first seismic evidence of the Gamburtsev Mountains, the first data suggesting Lake Vostok's existence, and a comprehensive new understanding of just how much of the continent's surface had never been observed, mapped, or accessed. The treaty they signed on the 1st of December 1959 was unlike any agreement previously negotiated. It designated Antarctica as a continent dedicated exclusively to peaceful purposes and scientific research. It prohibited military operations of any kind. It prohibited nuclear testing and the disposal of nuclear waste. It froze all existing territorial claims. 7 nations had already staked territory in Antarctica by the time the treaty was signed, preventing any of them from asserting those claims while the treaty remained in force. It opened all stations and installations to inspection by any signatory nation at any time. In 1991, the Madrid Protocol extended the treaty's reach. It designated Antarctica as a natural reserve and prohibited all activities related to mineral resources for 50 years. No mining, no oil extraction, no drilling for anything other than scientific ice cores. The ice, the rock beneath the ice, the lakes beneath the ice, the mountains beneath the ice, all of it placed beyond reach for at least half a century. The treaty entered into force in June of 1961. 57 nations have since agreed to it. The decision-making authority rests with 29 of them. There is a version of this story in which the Antarctic Treaty is exactly what it appears to be: a remarkable early example of international cooperation, a Cold War agreement that prevented one of the last unclaimed territories on Earth from becoming a zone of military competition and resource exploitation. In that version, the treaty succeeded. Antarctica has remained, in broad terms, what the framers said they intended it to be: a scientific preserve open to research and closed to conflict. That version is probably correct. But there is another question sitting inside it, and it does not require a conspiracy to ask. When those 12 nations sent their scientists to Antarctica in 1957 and 1958, they found a continent that was not what anyone had expected. They found not an empty plain of ice, but a geological archive, a landscape of mountains and lakes and river systems sealed under kilometers of ice for tens of millions of years, preserving a record of the world before the ice that no other place on Earth has preserved. They found a body of water the size of Lake Ontario that had been sealed in total darkness for 15 million years, and that appeared, when finally reached, to still contain life. They found a mountain range the size of the Alps that had never been seen, never been touched, and from which we have not to this day recovered a single rock sample. And then they gathered in Washington and signed an agreement that ensured all of it would remain exactly as they had found it, not temporarily. The treaty has no expiration date. The mining ban runs for 50 years from 1991, after which it may be extended by consensus, which means any signatory nation can block any change. In practice, the minerals under Antarctica, the oil under the ice shelves, and the biological organisms in the subglacial lakes will remain inaccessible for as long as the signatory nations agree they should. What they reached in 1820 was the surface of a continent that had been sealed by ice for 34 million years. What they found beneath the surface, when they finally had the tools to look, was an entire world, preserved more completely than anything else on Earth, still holding water, still holding life, still holding answers to questions about the planet's history that cannot be answered anywhere else. The old world is there, it has always been there. The ice sealed it first, millions of years before any human looked down from a ship and saw white. The nation sealed it again in 1959. The question is not whether they were right to do so. The question is what they understood about what they were sealing, and whether what they found in those 2 years of coordinated research changed the terms of the decision they were about to make. The treaty says it was about peace and science. That is almost certainly true. What it does not say is what the science found.